Let me very briefly introduce the other two members of the panel, Peter Mathieson and Victor Fung. Neither one really needs much of an introduction, so I won't use up too much time. Peter, as you know, is the Vice Chancellor and President of Hong Kong University. He's a distinguished medical doctor and biomedical scientist with a particular interest in autoimmune disorders with respect to kidney function, and many other things that have Latin names that I don't understand. He came to Hong Kong and became the Vice Chancellor in 2014. Before that, he was at the University of Bristol and the chairman of both medicine and dentistry anyway, a very distinguished scientist, and we're very lucky to have him in Hong Kong. Victor Fung, I guess, as I would describe as an important business leader and an important citizen of Hong Kong and China. He and I have known each other for more years than I probably should allow, having met and taught together at the Harvard Business School some time ago. Victor is a graduate of both MIT and Harvard, a Doctor of Business Administration and an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in electrical engineering. He has been the chairman of the council, the governing council of Hong Kong University, the chairman of the Airport Authority, a member of the People's Consultative Congress, and if I started listing the awards he's won, that would use up the remainder of the time. He's also, I consider him a very, very good friend. So I think the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask Peter and then Victor to reflect on what Rafael said and any other thoughts they have on the challenges that we face in the area of education and technology, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks very much, Mike. So it is a great privilege to be part of this panel. I feel honored to be in such great company. And I heard Rafael talk yesterday about MIT and about some of the ethos and some of the mission that MIT serves, and again just now, and I think it's truly inspirational. So I think what excites me about being in a university is that I consider that education holds the answer to most of the world's problems. And what we need to do is we need to make that opportunity available to the bright people of the world who will generate the solutions. So all we have to do, university presidents, basically is provide the environment, and then the energy and the ideas and the creativity will come from the people that we unleash into that environment. So I think what MIT is doing in making those opportunities available to unconventional kids, people from unconventional backgrounds, is absolutely terrific. And as I was the first member of my family to go to university, I consider that everything good that's happened in my life has been the result of education. And my job now is to try and provide those opportunities to other people. So I completely align with Rafael's thoughts on that. Just briefly to deal with education, technology and education, because he highlighted that point, and he was kind enough to mention that the University of Hong Kong was an early adopter of MOOCs and of other aspects of digital education. What I think, so there were people that were saying that MOOCs would spell the end of universities. I never believed that. What I think they do is they actually spell the beginning of a new way of universities functioning in the world. And one of the really exciting things that's been going on here is the way electronic education is being used to the benefit of our own students. And the sort of conceptual shift that comes with thinking we don't teach by the old-fashioned method of the so-called sage on the stage, where you stand in front of a group of students and pronounce for an hour on your ideas, and then they go away feeling grateful. What we do instead is that we turn it around and we use the classroom for the discussion, the analysis, the problem solving, and a lot of the actual teaching can be done outside the classroom. And that concept really has come with MOOCs. And so for me, we are doing MOOCs. We are providing access to our educational expertise to millions of people around the world, and I think that's terrific. But actually also, we've revolutionized our own teaching experience for our own students. with some of the same methodologies. And I think that's absolutely terrific. And I think we owe it to visionary people like those at MIT and Harvard that founded edX. And we also collaborate with Coursera, so there are two major platforms, and we're working with both of them. And I think it's been transformational in terms of using modern technology to improve education. And I think there are, as Rafael said, there are two components to it. There's your own students, and then there's the rest of the world, and we want to address both. So I think we're proud of our contributions there, and I think that the world is a better place for places like MIT opening up to people that are not enrolled as their students. And the MicroMasters is a fantastic idea. I think it's great, and I'm probably going to copy it. Then to deal with the issue of the day, technology and how it's going to affect the world. And I mean, I'm known for my relentless optimism. I wouldn't have taken on this job if I wasn't an optimist. I feel extraordinarily optimistic about the future. I'm a great respecter of human ingenuity. And I think we shouldn't wring our hands and worry about technology and think, oh my God, what are we going to do? What are these people going to, what are they going to do for a living? How are they going to occupy themselves? Because human ingenuity will solve the problem. We know that technological advances are irresistible. I mean, we all completely live our lives through these things now. A few years ago, we didn't even have them. We just have to adapt. So like any problem, I think what you have to do is first of all acknowledge that there is a problem and then work out how you're going to solve it. But I don't feel pessimistic about it at all. I think that technology will transform the way we live our lives, and I think it'll ultimately be a positive. It does create new issues, and my background, as you said, is in health. And for me, the whole subject is sort of crystallized into one issue, and that is that the world is getting older. So populations are aging all around the world, and in this part of the world, that's doubled, the impact of that is doubled by the falling birth rate. So we have increasing numbers of old people and decreasing numbers of young people that will look after the old people. So there's an explosion in a particular need, and that is caring. Now, if Dr. Tsai and her colleagues solve the problem of Alzheimer's, that's great. But those people are then going to live even longer, and they're going to have even greater needs. So one of the great paradoxes of healthcare is that the more and more successful we become. So I'm a kidney doctor. In the 1960s, dialysis was invented for the first time, and kidney transplantation. And so a whole load of people that would have died young now don't. They now live older, and they get other health problems. And so we're a victim of our own success. And if Alzheimer's is solved, then that's terrific. But there is still a finite limit to human life, and it's probably about 120 years. And there are various predictions as to why that's the case. And if we all live to 120, we're all going to need someone to look after us. If we have driverless cars and Uber, so that nobody needs to own their own car, there'll be a whole load of taxi drivers unemployed. They will turn into the carers. So when you and I get old, Mike, we're going to be looked after by a taxi driver. But there's a sort of explosion in need for caring. I think this is the big growth industry. And I think populations need to think about how they're going to care for elderly people, many of whom will have cognitive impairment, most of whom will be isolated. They won't have younger generations to look after them. Technology can solve that problem. Robots, remote sensing, various other devices will be the answer to the way to deal with an aging population. It's not going to come from molecular biology or cell biology that I spent all my career working on. That's not going to provide the answer to an aging population. It's social science. It's stopping people from falling down. It's detecting them when they have fallen down. It's helping them to stand up again. And all of those things can come from technology. And we're going to have a need for caring. So I think all the people that are rendered unemployed by technology will be needed to care for the world's aging population. And for me, that's quite a tantalizing prospect.
Thank you, Peter. We'll come back to a number of those things, but what you put me in mind of is what we're wrestling with now is not a permanent condition. What makes it difficult is it's a difficult transition. I think and so I share your optimism about getting there eventually. But I think the problem of doing it as well as we can, you know, when we have skills mismatches and, you know, lots of job changes and other things, remains a significant challenge. Victor, I'm hoping, Victor, among other things, you have insights into many things, but we could surely benefit from your insights about the way technology is changing global supply chains and indeed the whole structure of the global economy. So,
wow, that might be topic for another conference. But thank you, Mike. You know, the first thing I'd like to say is, Rafael, really, the speech that you gave was truly inspirational. You know, and I speak as an alumnus of MIT, and I think I'm very proud of the way that you're really taking the institution forward. And I must say, as I was sitting there listening to your speech, I'm reminded of the motto of MIT, Mens and Menace, which really means hands and mind. And really the whole idea of, you know, learning by doing, I think is really central to everything that we do today in the world, in my mind. I'm very much inspired by the fact that you're really looking at universities' functions, not the traditional teaching and research, but you've added the whole concept of innovation. It's a three-legged stool. Now, I think this is absolutely crucial, and the way you've defined innovation is how to get the ideas, the really path-breaking ideas generated in universities rapidly into creating good for society. And I feel that that is absolutely the thing that we really all need to work on. Because the thing that's really driving the world today is speed. And because of the improvement in technology itself, the cycle times are so short. Now, maybe in years past, maybe in centuries past, you know, one may want to or could be an ivory tower. Because if you're not encumbered by immediate issues, you can really look long-term and have breakthrough. But you are given a lot of time to actually let those ideas permeate into society. Now, frankly, you don't have time. If you don't get those ideas rapidly into society, they're gone. You need a new set of ideas because the environment is changing so rapidly. So this change of response time in the world is completely changed the role that universities, in my mind, need to play. Now, of course, we need to be very careful about the balance. We cannot then have university just make incremental breakthroughs and never the long-term breakthrough, which you also touch on. So in the process of adding innovation, in my mind, Rafael, we need to also think about how we preserve the focus of that long-term vision. And what you said about very patient venture capital is absolutely key. I have yet to find a very, very patient venture capitalist. But maybe we have to create some. The idea that you may wait 10, 15 years for your return. But the benefits is not only dramatic for yourself, but for creating public good. But I think we cannot lose that vision either. So I'm absolutely not a proponent of the ivory tower, but I think the pure ivory tower theory needs to be completely re-examined in light of the response times that are happening in the world. Now, I think the other thing I would like to say is, I don't know if I can answer your question in a very short time. There's huge amounts happening in the world, and obviously in the world of supply chains. You know, we're really now looking after, 30 years of global supply chain development. We're now really looking at global supply chains 2.0, and which is completely dependent on the use of new technology. And a lot of it is actually occasioned by the machine that, Peter, you just showed, which completely enabled the consumer. And if you start with the consumer being totally different and completely enabled differently, and then the impact is all the way up the supply chain, all the way to the creation process. So really, because of that change, every part of the supply chain needs to be felt. So we really need to incorporate all the ideas about data analytics, 3D printing, Those are really forefront now. And then coming very rapidly on the back of that would be artificial intelligence and blockchains. You know, how contracts could be actually smart contracts, people call it. And all that will be incorporated in the global supply chain. But having said that, I like to generalize that to a more perhaps general response from the private sector to what you said, Rafael. I think you have given a mission and a vision for the educational sector. But now as recipients of the education and the graduates, I think, frankly, the private sector and society generally also have a key role to play in how to handle this new environment. If there's one thing that the new technology will bring about, would be the need to create new employment, in my mind. As you say, the more you advance technologically, there are wonderful things that you create, and I like to spend a lot of time thinking about how new jobs could be created because of the new technology. But you cannot avoid the fact that, and it's a reality, that you're also destroying old jobs. Now, you're hoping that you're creating new jobs faster than destroying old jobs. But even if you can do that, the point must be that the people, the taxi drivers, need to learn how to care for the old people. There's a huge re-education process. And I think how you handle that, I think, is crucial. And how you employ technology to handle that, I would say, massive re-education is going to be, I think, a major impact to the stability of the world. So my point, actually, for my own self, whether supply chain or really for those of you in the audience who are from the private sector, is that we need to also embrace these concepts and meet it halfway. We need to do a lot more in terms of training and learning and so on within the companies themselves to actually meet the universities as a university move forward towards us in innovation. And I think it's a collaboration. We need to really do a lot more. And I've spent a lot of time in recent years within our own company, and many of us, I think, in the private sector. You would be, you probably in the old jargon characterize this as building corporate universities, in-house learning. But it's very different. The type of learning is all learning by doing. We don't really sit in classrooms listening to wonderful case studies about other people. It's all about action learning. You know, you have real projects, and then you have professors working with our people, actually learning while they're doing the projects. It's action learning. It's learning by doing. And I think the whole internal education process and the retraining process needs to be really looked at so that we do our part in the private sector to actually, meet, sort of halfway. And I must say that you've now given me a real headache that will keep me awake. How do I create 10, 15-year patient venture capital? And I think that's going to be an important issue. Thank you, Mike.
Just good luck with that. Thank you, Victor. Could I just follow up with one quick question to you, Victor? You've been in Lee and Fung and in your companies engaged in what you just described, which is really serious, continuous upgrading of at all levels. Are you, in your judgment, are you keeping up with the pace of change? That, if you see what I mean?
No, unfortunately, my son, Spence Fung, who now is CEO of the company, he came from Silicon Valley. That was his first, career, and there's no way to keep up with these guys. Every time I think I've understood what he was trying to tell me last time, he's coming up with something new. So the answer is no. I'm struggling.
Good. Yeah, join the club.
Yeah.
Rafael, you've now listened to this. Do you have any thoughts on these issues? You and I were talking before, and it's fairly clear the universities have an important role in your vision And now implementation of that vision is a very important part of succeeding in a rapidly changing world. But it's not the whole story. So the question is, who else has to join the party in order to get the job thoroughly done? Victor mentioned business, and I couldn't agree with that more, but could you say a few words about that side of the thing?
Well, yeah, I think, let me just say that I fully agree with two major points that were mentioned by the three of you. One is that technology is actually enabling education. It's making it more fun, I should say, more easier for students to learn on campus, thanks to technology. It also has made it easier to educate millions of people. And people who are curious to learn, they have access to knowledge now that they didn't have 10 years ago or more. So those are the good news. The bad news is the point that both Peter and Victor mentioned, that technology is creating jobs while displacing jobs. And that is extremely painful to families. But that is something that personally, I think I would blame society for that. Because we have known that always technology displaces jobs. I mean, in the 19th century, we transported food and people with horse carriages, and there were many people driving those carriages to transport goods. Cars came, and then these people didn't know how to drive cars, so those jobs disappeared. So that is always the case, and it's not going to stop. So a society that understands that technology is continuously the wave of the future, and technology will eliminate jobs and doesn't prepare the population to retrain them for the new jobs is at fault here. And I think that is the key issue. But society does not mean I'm blaming the government or I'm blaming the private sector or I'm blaming universities. I'm blaming society means all of us. And I think what we need to do now is recognize that a great deal of damage has been made in the last 10 years or so because of technology in the incomes and at least in the US of middle-income families. And we have to do something about it. And that includes universities such as ours, includes the private sector, and includes the government to organize. I have heard a large number of CEOs in the US, not just of technology companies, of all companies, that they have told me with a great deal of pain that they are laying off people because they don't have the right skills. And they say that with indeed pain. And at the same time, they have plenty of job openings that they cannot fill because they don't find the qualified people. So companies are seeking help. They would like to find a way to retrain the people in terms of laying them off. But they are by themselves incapable of doing it. They're asking universities for help, and we are willing to help, but it's a much bigger issue. So I think that is an important issue we're facing in the US right now. Other countries in development will start facing it very, very soon. And unless we recognize that and have a program that addresses that, we'll continue to have this problem. So that, to me, is a huge issue that Victor pointed out. I never thought what Peter said, that the retraining of the jobs and the job security of the future is in a caring economy, which absolutely is true. I never thought of that. So maybe there is an opportunity there as well. But I think that is an issue that I don't know how to address it simply. It's not something that Peter and I can do by ourselves with colleges. It's not something that Victor can do in the private sector. It requires all of us, but it is a huge, huge issue.
I just, as a kind of add-on to that insight, and I couldn't agree with that more, a guy named Ted Alden at the Council on Foreign Relations has just produced a book, but it's basically about falling behind in this dimension. But you did a lot of homework, you know, so in the Northern European countries, I think by most people's standards, the social security systems that have been built around retraining and so on, and with significant resources going into them, that's not the whole solution, but they're pretty advanced compared to many other parts of the world. And so he cited the following statistic. Denmark spends 2% of its national income, gross domestic product, on on this kind of retraining stuff. The United States spends 1/10 of 1%. It's just not enough. As a kind of the sort of complementary sort of social or public sector investment. Victor.
Yeah, Mike, can I add to that debate? I think we're all beginning now to recognize that we've now had at least a decade of the development of, shall we say, an increasingly unequal distribution of income. And we're all seeing that, signs of that in Brexit, elections, et cetera, et cetera. And against that background, we now have the issue that we're talking about. And I think the thing that I still come back to, and it's been drummed into me in recent years, is just how fast the world is changing and the response time that is needed. So on the one hand, I'm a taxi driver. I need to learn how to care for old people. I used to have years to learn that. And your point, Phil, for the retraining. But now I need to do it very quickly, or I'm going to be really out in the streets. And the combination of those two things, unfortunately, have produced a sense of helplessness. And I think a lot of that is being manifested in society, and rightly so. And I feel that we have for too long put aside, we're economists, so we've been maximizing the mean, and we forgot about the whole distribution, And we thought the perfect market would take care of the distribution issue. So that's a problem, right? Now we recognize that, and now we've got the technological change against a background of very, very fast cycle time. I think that's the challenge. And it produces in society and people a sense of helplessness and really a real desire to recontrol their own fate. And you can the referendums in Europe, that's again and again the sort of issues that come out. Right?
Don't get me started. Peter?
I just wanted to pick up, I agree with Victor's point, but speed, doing things quickly is a major challenge to universities. I think that's the way universities need to adapt. We don't do things quickly. Universities are conservative, risk-averse, traditional sort of environments, and we're not particularly nimble, we're not particularly responsive, and I think that needs to change. And the other point I'd make about universities is if you look at, particularly in Europe, some of the universities are 800 or 900 years old. They've survived wars, famines, plague. They are the most enduring aspect of most modern societies. And so in another 800 or 900 years, this university and his university and other universities will still be there. And so they're going to be a rock of society. They're going to be the answer to society's problems, but they do need to adapt. They do need to be quicker. They do need to be more versatile, because at the moment, universities are really rather slow machines.
May I ask a question? How many in the audience agree with Peter? Raise your hands.
I think that was unanimous. I'm an economist, so let me try to put this way. We have, in a number of different ways, if you look at this from the labor market point of view, all of this technology and stuff put in economic terms has moved the demand side of the labor market all over the place very quickly. It's the point you've all made. And we have defined the problem as the supply side is falling behind. Is there anything we can do to sort of help it catch up, right? Whereas the supply side is code for what universities can do, what governments can do, what individuals can do, et cetera, but businesses can do. Doesn't it make sense, at least in theory, to ask, should we let the demand side move that fast? This is what Trump has done, okay? We operated in a world for most of the post-war period. I know I'm going to run sideways to something Victor believes in deeply in about 1 minute, but what Trump basically has said, translated into these terms, is if you let globalization and technology sort of run, at their own speed, without mucking around with it, then you may have a problem, because the time constants in the supply side responses, you're talking about human capital, are very large. Let me finish this, Victor. So
No.
Trump said, Trump said, at least in America, we built this open global dynamic thing, in the post-war period that has just done wonders for a whole lot of people, billions of people. But it's created problems for us in keeping up. And so we built this thing, and then this next priority was, let's do the best job we can with inclusive, sustainable growth patterns. And he's saying, I'm reversing those priorities. We're going to focus on, pick your country, produce the best sustainable growth patterns, and then, adults can negotiate mutually beneficial things. This is dumping multilateralism and other things, Victor. So,
Yeah.
but if I can just add one thing, I learned this in developing countries, right? Developing countries know kind of what the destination is, open up, become part of the global economy, but they don't do it overnight. The Indian economy has the most fragmented retail system in the world, right? And then people come along and say, well, let Walmart and Carrefour and everybody in. And they say, yeah, eventually, but not tomorrow, right? There's tens of millions of people selling stuff out of carts. If you did it that way, you just couldn't keep up, right? So the art I learned in sort of economic development is modulating the pace of change or the forcing mechanisms to the ability of the entity you're dealing with to sort of keep up. So I just wanted to kind of put it in those terms and ask if it rings a bell with any of you.
Well, let me just respond very quickly so we don't just do a economist to economist. We've been doing this for many years. I think, Mike, I think we need to also remember one more thing about the world. It's not only faster, but absolutely much more interconnected. The question that you're posing, and maybe Mr. Trump is posing, can you go back to a protectionist world where you have large enough critical mass in anything that you could actually then draw a moat around it and be internally self-sufficient? There is a move towards that, what we call local for local. There is a move. But then what happens to the smaller economies that cannot do that? So that's the first issue. The second issue on the demand-supply side, you're absolutely right. We're trying to fix the problem by why can't the supply respond faster? I think, yeah, they're trying to, but it's not that easy to move the supply side. I think the people that are creating the demand ought to solve some of the supply issue. Meaning, frankly, if we have the need for this type of retraining and so on, we better take care of some of that internally and be really ready to show that responsibility and not say, hey, Rafael, Peter, please give me these types of people. That's what I can use today. But I still, frankly, consistent with our values and so on, we need to also think about the people existing in our organizations that don't have those skills. You need to cater for them. So I think we need to really take on some of the supply issue ourselves. That's why I mentioned the word corporate university. And there's a new model for corporate universities now emerging, which are really working in close collaboration with the universities to really address this issue.
Good. Can I ask Peter and Rafael? I was once, not at your level, but an academic administrator. It can be a little frustrating at times. These institutions are democratic for a good reason, right? Which is you have to pool expertise to make excellent appointments and judge research and so on. But both of you have both a vision and a considerable track record in getting things done in this world that's requiring faster responses and multidisciplinary research when we all love living in our silos and stuff. So my question to both of you is, how do you do this? I mean, and retain this core capability in the institution, which is decentralized decision-making.
Well, I'll try and answer that. I just wanted to comment on the point that you made. I mean, I don't think, I'm not an economist and I don't pretend to understand Donald Trump, but I just think it is completely unrealistic to think that you can get the world to take its foot off the gas. It's just not going to happen. And he may think it's going to happen, and he may think he can influence it, and good luck to him. But I just think it's not realistic. So the fact, we have this technological explosion, we have to deal with its consequences. And as I said earlier on, I'm optimistic that we will. I agree it's posing major challenges to society right now, and it will do so for a generation. But I actually think that we will emerge from it. How do we make things happen in universities? I mean, that's an interesting self-reflection question for Rafael and me. Basically, I was taught a couple of tricks in my early days in academic medicine. One is that you have to convince people that what you want is what they want. So, in other words, they think it's their idea, but they're actually doing what you want. Basically, being a university president is about two things, in my opinion. One is about people management, and then to a lesser extent about money management. I mean, we have to be money managers, but we have other expertise that we can call upon to help us in that respect. But it's mostly about people management. And universities are full of clever people who all think they know the right answers. And our job is to corral them into, not to inhibit them, but to corral them into some sort of strategic direction. And I think you can do that by consensus building. You've got to be willing to be wrong. You've got to be willing to listen to somebody who knows better than you, because this university and every other university I've ever worked in is full of people much cleverer than me. So, I've got to be willing to listen to them. But I've also got to try and keep the big picture in mind and try and stop people from straying off in a way that's unhelpful. So I think it's about people management. I think it's about willing to recognize experts and learn from both your students and your staff, because that's the other thing we do, is we collect groups of very clever people who will come up with solutions that we'd never even thought of.
You're very brave for going first. So I have no clue how to answer that question, Michael. I think, let me just say this much. Let me do what I do every day for a few more years. After that, I'll reflect how it is that I did, and I'll write a book, and I'll let you know. The one thing that I do want to mention is that there is no question that the two largest economies in the world for years to come will be those of China and the United States. And we want to ensure that the populations, not just China and the US and the rest of the world, have a way to aspire for a better life and a way to feed their families and provide education and so forth. And it is up to these two countries to figure out how to help the rest of the world. And I also would like to mention that the tendencies that I've seen in some of the leaders of both nations to isolate their economies, I believe, not being an economist, not being a politician, just as a regular citizen of the world, is a step in the wrong direction. I think that we want a peaceful solution for all the issues in the world, and the more mutually dependent those two economies are, the more peaceful the world is going to be.
No, I think that's a very important point. Just to, and not in any way to disagree, if you flip this over, or listen to Danny Roderick, the leading development economist of his generation, the problem that came from people like me, our profession, was we always thought there were special interests that wanted to produce protectionism. And so we overstated the case for openness, right? The truth is, as Danny said, there were special interests that wanted openness, right? And they tended to be the people with the money. And so it was just an imbalanced thing. So when we say maybe we're not going to be able to operate with this sacrosanct thing, which is the open system, we're not saying shut down the walls on all sides. What Trump's saying is anything that's mutually beneficial, he thinks himself as a super negotiator, right? Anyway, I think that's a bit the direction we're going. Peter, on your point about technology, you may be right, okay? But there's a lot of levers where you can control the pace by which technology actually impacts society. Take self-driving cars. The regulators are going to get in the middle of this. You can't stop the technology. Take cybersecurity. I mean, I think we're pretty close to the end of the notion that we can have a completely open, privacy-preserving, global internet. And our friends just to the north of us have completely rejected that notion, altogether. They just don't buy any of it, right? So while we're not used to the idea that we need to think carefully, and in your field, I mean, you have doctors and medical ethicists sort of thinking about some of these more radical, developments in biomedical science. So I guess I'm not saying we know how to do that, but I'm saying the notion that, it's just like a tsunami coming at us may not be quite right.
I mean, it's interesting you talk about medical ethics, because I was just going to make exactly that point. So we've got a collaboration with Cambridge, the other Cambridge, the UK Cambridge, in medical ethics and law. And we had a visiting speaker from Cambridge probably about a year ago, and he was talking about prenatal technologies. And the point he made, which I thought was really powerful, is that the technology has outstripped the regulation. So we've got things which are possible now prenatally, and we have no regulatory or ethical framework to deal with it. And so the question is, does that mean we shouldn't do it? Does that mean we should put a block on prenatal diagnosis or prenatal intervention? There are some people, including in the United States, that believe the answer to that is yes. I don't. I believe the answer is no. I think we should do it, and I think we should work to advance the regulatory and ethical framework to deal with it, because I think it's a significant advance for mankind. So I don't think the fact that what's possible has outstripped the ethical framework is a reason for stopping the progress. Far from it. I think we need to deal with it.
Yeah. Mike, on your first point about openness and multilateralism, we're all brought up in the Western liberal open market tradition. I think if you go back to look at the history of liberalization around the world, I think the initial stages of liberalization where we liberalized trading in goods and then a little bit into services actually worked extremely well. I think there's mountains of evidence that has actually alleviated poverty, etc. However, at one point, people tried to extend that into financial services, and there was a lot of resistance. And now I think there's a general recognition that you cannot throw financial services into the same pot as general, just complete liberalization, mainly because you have a huge amount of side effects. Now, I think the same thing is now happening to the whole notion of openness on migration and cross-border movement of people. I think what people are around really saying is, maybe that's another aspect that you cannot just say, let's liberalize, and liberalize completely. And you need to exert some controls over the borders. And it's a more nuanced form of liberalization that one has to really think a little deeper and not just say, since liberalization in goods are good, therefore liberalization generally must be good for everything, including financial flows, including people flows. And I think you need to just nuance each of those. And that's really what you're seeing in the referendums in Europe and so on. And then I would just like to completely endorse Rafael's point. The reality today is the most important bilateral relationship is between the United States and China. The way I would rather look at it, though, is it's not a G2. I don't agree with that concept. It's really a concept where it's really a very complex non-zero-sum game in which both economies would collaborate on some things and compete on others, and be very comfortable developing that sort of new relationship. You cannot characterize, friend or foe. There's no such thing. Nobody's pure friend, nobody's pure foe. And you cannot characterize every episode as a win or lose. It's much more nuanced. And the way I look at that bilateral relationship is, it is the most important, but it's a necessary but not sufficient condition in my mind, Rafael. If the US and China agree on something, then I think there's an opportunity for a multilateral solution, like the climate change in Paris. If they don't agree, I don't think there's a chance. But if they agree, it doesn't mean it would happen. I don't think they can dictate. You really got to get the rest of the world in line and agree. So I think it's a necessary but not sufficient condition in that bilateral relationship.
Yeah, I think maybe nuanced, maybe a little bit in short supply on one side of that relationship, but we'll see. I had one very difficult question. We've sort of touched on it, but let me ask you all to reflect on this. And as I warned you about this before, this is a question that kind of goes straight at the problem, or one version of the problem we have. And I don't think anybody pretends to have a complete answer to this, so I'm more interested in, before we turn it over to the audience, to what you think is a reasonable way to get started on this. So let me just dive in. So the question goes like this. Some combination of globalization and the digital technologies, I think, are the ones that have done the most to strip away jobs. Arguably have pulled the economic rug from under the middle class, at least in the developed countries, and maybe if you believe the forecasts of 3D printing, artificial intelligence, deep learning algorithms, and so on, we're closer to the start than the end of this. And these patterns, job and income polarization and its causes, well documented by MIT economists and others who have followed them. Declining trends in intergenerational mobility, Raj Chetty at Stanford and a number of other brilliant young economists. These things, I think, are not just speculation anymore. And you could argue that these trends have been a contributing factor in the widening nationalist and populist, political trends that we're seeing. And so it looks like a whole lot of things are getting shaky. Political and social cohesion, multilateralism, growth and development options for early stage developing, the poor developing countries, European unification. I mean, I live in Europe, and it sure looks to me like nationalist and populist policies are going to make it very difficult to get to the end goal that the framers of the European Union had. All of this seems to be in doubt. In short, sort of major components of the sort of post-war economic and global order that we've gotten used to seem to be a little shaky, if not crumbling at the foundations. So my question really is this too pessimistic of you? And if there's some truth to it, then what are reasonable things that leaders like you guys in business, government, and education think we need to try to do, not just separately, but together, to try to bring back political and social cohesion, and probably along with it some reasonably inclusive, sustainable growth patterns. I know that's an unfair question, but just some thoughts on how to make a little progress on that, other than what you've already said, would be great. Victor?
No, Mike, it is a huge issue. It may be the issue that you've just framed, may be the issue of the coming decade for the world. Let me just make two very quick points. The first is the whole issue of multilateralism we started to talk about. And we all know that the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, the multilateral system that we have today that originated 70 years ago, right after the Second World War, is in bad need of repair. It hasn't happened. But there is a ray of hope. I think there is a new form of multilateralism emerging, really in the form of the Belt and Road concept and what's called the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And at least in the finance area, it is a multilateralism that is a lot more inclusive, a lot more based on, the level of contribution on a pro rata basis. Now, of course, AIIB is initiated by China, but I don't think it's dominated by China. It is very much, in my mind, a new model of multilateralism, and it could be developed. And if, in fact, Donald Trump chooses to join that, then I think then you've effectively, and then the Japanese join together, then effectively you've got most of the players in the world. So I think that's the first thought. The second thought is a completely different one. I've been looking at consumer research reports around different markets. We operate about 40 markets in the world. And one piece of research that keeps coming back at me, which I keep rejecting, I said, this can't be right. But I must say the evidence is overwhelming. And that is when you survey the millennials, the young people in different countries, they all say we have more in common with the millennials in other countries than with the older folks in our own. Now, something we need to reflect a little bit. I say this can't be right. So I kept rejecting this, and the evidence came back again and again, 60, 70% overwhelming. Now, if that proposition is true, then there's hope for us all. Is that really true? I'm still questioning it. I keep trying to find research that says different. But it's overwhelming, and that's maybe induced by the new technology. Now, if in fact that's true, then we have the hope of forming, shall we say, a global millennial class. And that's, the future belongs to them.
So yes, I do think it's an unduly pessimistic analysis. You'd expect me to say that. But I think it's got truth in it. And I think there's also differences in different parts of the world. So if I make the comparison between Europe and the UK, which I know best, and Hong Kong, the best thing about my job is that I work in a place that completely understands the value of education. Everybody, whether they're educated or not, in this part of the world, values education. It's a pretty sweeping generalization, but I think it's true. Whereas that's not the case in the UK. And the thing that's distressed me most about the UK and Brexit, which I consider a disaster, is the anti-intellectualism that went along with it. You had a former education minister in the UK who made the statement that we've had enough of experts. I think this is profoundly worrying about the UK. And I think the American election campaign also featured quite a lot of anti-intellectual rhetoric. And I think we have a job to do to resist that. So the problem, the danger for us, sitting up here and pronouncing on what we think is the solution, is that half the world is not listening. We need to engage that part of the world. The only intellectual argument I heard in favor of Brexit was a discussion I went to in Hong Kong where a speaker, he happened to be British, but he was arguing for Brexit. And the main plank of his argument was that Europe is going to be increasingly irrelevant. And so therefore, whether it's united or divided actually doesn't really matter that much, because the part of the world that's going to drive the future is actually Asia. And I think if that may or may not be true, but I think in educational terms, this part of the world gets it. This part of the world understands the value of education, self-improvement. The biggest donors to this university are not alumni. They're not alumni of this university or alumni of any other university. They're people who didn't receive tertiary education themselves. In some cases, didn't receive secondary education, but they still appreciate the value of education and they want to provide that for others. So this part of the world gets it. And I think the rest of the world, particularly Europe, and I guess probably North America as well, could learn from Asia the value of education, because I think there's a more engaged population belief in education here than certainly there was in the UK, and I believe in other parts of the Western world.
When I heard that question, Michael, my initial reaction is, that's such a deep question. You must think we're really that smart to be able to answer. I can just make two quick comments. One is that I fully agree with Victor when he mentioned that this is the unnecessary condition is for the two largest economies to agree in a particular direction, but they should not dictate. They should work with others. And that is a major point that I'm going to come back to in a moment. I was of the thought that a variety of the issues, and that's a very complex and deep and important question, Michael, you ask, a variety of some underlining component that is part of the solution is, as Peter said, education. At the same time, the experience that we have had with our online approach, the digital approach with MITx and edX, is that a great number of people in the world are hungry for education, and now they have access and they are getting it. But we created another unexpected problem. In countries like China and the US, there are jobs. We don't have the right people trained for those jobs. We have to retrain them and so forth. And that's an issue that education can help and technology can help. But what we have done also is inadvertently educated a lot of people in many countries in the world in which they expect to get educated, they're hungry for it, but there are no jobs for them to use that education. That is, and to me, that is part of the solution of that complex question you ask. If we don't have, if there are no job supply, even for people who are educated, and in many countries that is the case today, then we have a much more global problem, way beyond China and the US. And I think one way to address that, it has to be also, and I try to touch upon very briefly on my remarks, is we are used to a society in which the trade-off is I get an education, a job appears, I use my education to get a job. And we may have to start educating individuals that by necessity, they may have to become entrepreneurs. They may have to figure out how to create their own jobs. They have to figure out what is that the surroundings need, what is that my town needs, my city needs, and create something that is needed. And that is a switch that has to come on, that instead of thinking Victor has to get a job and I'm going to apply to it with my knowledge, there may not be a Victor in your town, and you may have to become that Victor, and you have to become what is that the town needs. And every town has needs, and figure out how you yourself can supply that need.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I think there are bits and pieces of that showing up in the sharing economy area, you know, the kind of part-time work and so on, but that's really insightful. The other thing you see, frankly, I see it in Italy, it fits exactly your description. I don't know if you had it in mind. And the other thing is mobility. I mean, there's just tons of young people who are going somewhere else. Okay, Hope. Time for okay. Are you ready for difficult questions from the audience?
Ready for difficult questions. I just wanted to say one more thing. Picking up a bit on what Rafael just said, I mean, education doesn't always make people happy. You know, so I give you a specific example. You know, I've done a lot of teaching in Uganda, and we provided medical education to a group of bright Ugandan medical students that in the short term didn't make them happy. It made them miserable because it actually opened them up to what's possible if you have better resources and better infrastructure and all the rest of it. So actually, you then have to deal with, okay, we've educated all these people, but now they can't apply their education because they're frustrated by the situation they're in. And what we didn't want in that situation, we didn't want everyone to think, I'm going to go and work in the US or in the UK. The whole idea was to improve the infrastructure in Uganda. So you can sometimes create new problems by delivering education. So I think we just have to recognize that it's not a nirvana situation. You know, we've got a responsibility to provide the education, but also to help people to use it.